So, as mentioned previously, Hawker was an imprint of Roadrunner Records that came about when Holly Lane opened up the New York Roadrunner offices in 1986. The imprint itself would come to be short-lived, but this is a slight deviation from the main Roadrunner story, is pretty critical to understanding the Roadrunner business practices and trends, because obviously, because it was just an imprint of Roadrunner Records, it's effectively a child company. It still follows the same business model in a very, very similar capacity. So it really does serve as like a good prelude to part 2, which I'm working on. We can get into the nitty-gritty on what exactly these bands had to deal with on a daily basis. Similarly, Hawker Records does serve as a prominent landmark in the story of the New York City hardcore scene of the late 80s. Things like CBGBs and all that good shit. So, this entire story is very much born of an awesome interview with Hawker founder John Bello for a publication called No Echo. No Echo is available online, and this interview is available online, and I will be sure to include the link wherever this is being thrown up, which, if it's anything like the first part, it will be on Spotify, it will be on YouTube, it will be on our blog. If you just Google Temple of Blair blog, it will be somewhere floating around in the infosphere. So let's talk for a little bit about John Bello. Born and raised in Canarsie, Brooklyn. Let me know if I've not pronounced that correctly. John came from what I'm kind of regarding as like your sort of standard metalhead background in terms of music. I think a lot of metalheads, they tend to get started on your classic rock, like your Zeppelins and maybe even your Rolling Stones, maybe your Deep Purples and your Sabbaths and things like that. Things that will be considered classic rock in the sort of conventional zeitgeist. But he got into the Ramones after watching the Uncle Floyd Show, which is was a New York local variety show, and that kind of set the scene for him. That's it. Now he's into hardcore. That switched him straight over to punk and hardcore. He served a stint as the music director at Brooklyn College's radio station, which is a trend you'll see throughout this industry. A lot of the main players end up working in college radio. That's where they tend to get their starts. So while he was working at Brooklyn College's radio station, he was sent all manner of records from any record labels who wanted any of their shit playing. It's a great way to get yourself exposed to new music, I guess, because all the labels want you, the college radio station, to play their stuff. So after a while there, he eventually worked at Tower Records in the cassette department. So on moving from college radio to Roadrunner, John Bello said, "I found out that one of the guys I worked with at Tower Records was married to a woman named Holly Lane, who worked at Roadrunner Records. He mentioned that his wife was looking for an intern. So it was a great way for me to learn the business. I was calling radio stations to see if they were playing the Roadrunner artists and all that kind of stuff. We were pushing King Diamond a lot because that was the artist who was the big seller for the label at the time. We can deduce from all that this was in 1987 and around the Abigail album cycle for King Diamond, as mentioned previously. That was the one that made the top 20, or top 20, top 200 in Billboard charts. So Fatal Portrait, which is King Diamond's debut, came out in 1986. But all I could find was that it sold over 100,000 in the US to date, as opposed to 1986. So yeah, I'm thinking this is 1987 when John's getting his internship at Roadrunner. So Holly Lane was Roadrunner's first US hire, but also the chief operating officer of the US arm. However, it will become clear that, like Case, she wore many, many hats. In recruiting John as an intern, it seems that John inherited some of Holly's duties in A&R in that capacity. So when John was asked about his relationship with the founder of Roadrunner Records, Case Wessels, he was a great guy. The first artist I remember telling him to sign was Rollins Band. Or maybe Rollins Band, depending on how you pronounce it. Henry Rollins called me and said he wanted 50 grand for the deal, which wasn't bad at all. But he wanted to keep all of the publishing. I told Case, and he was like, "Oh no, we don't do that." Roadrunner kept all the publishing back then. I argued that Rollins tore his arse off, but Case didn't want to do it without his publishing money. The second artist I told Case to sign will make you laugh. Holly had given me a demo tape of Vernon Reed's Living Colour. I loved the tape and went to see them at CBGB's, and then told Case we needed to sign them. Case said, "A black rock band will never make it in the United States. A year later, they're selling millions of records and touring with the Rolling Stones. And Case goes, John, I'm really upset because you didn't force me to sign Living Colour. I think he felt obligated to help me sign some bands after that because he felt so bad about the whole Living Colour thing. So that's an interesting sign of the times. Got to remember that Case comes from a very... he's immediately post-war, isn't he? He's practically the greatest generation, if I'm not mistaken. He must have been born, if not during the war, then immediately after. The statement that a black rock band will never make it in the United States, perhaps a little bit short-sighted on his part. So there's two main things that are quite telling for me in that statement. Regardless of the above, Case still comes across as quite the top geezer. John describes him as a great guy. Everyone seems to have this kind of relationship for him. They don't really have a lot of bad things to say about him. John also mentions that he was a great guy. I actually think Case is still alive. Maybe John doesn't know that. I don't know. Secondly, we get our first proper insight into the bog-standard Roadrunner deal. Roadrunner keeps all publishing. This means that they have the leverage in every transaction involving the distribution or the broadcasting of the song, artist, album, blah, 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 anything. So you can't lend your music to your mate's radio station. You got to run it past Case. You got to do all that, run it all past Case, and Roadrunner takes a slice of the pie whenever that music is played. That seems to be the mainstay in any Roadrunner deal. The thing I find quite contentious is the fact that John says that 50 grand for Rollins Band is a good deal, and you'll find out in a little while as I go through. So remember, at this point, Hawker Records isn't a thing yet. We're still in Roadrunner world. John's working under Holly as an intern. As we mentioned in part 1, Roadrunner was toe-to-toe with Combat and the newly formed In Effect Records, both imprints of Relativity Records. So just to add a bit of spice in there, John wanted to put out a split record with Sick of It All and Crackdown, but an individual named Howie Abrams from In Effect, one of their competitors, ended up snatching Sick of It All on Relativity. So that's a name you need to remember, Howie Abrams. So in the context of this, it looks like Roadrunner is identifying the competitors, especially in New York City. That's where all these great labels are based. And eventually, Case asks John, so that music that you're always playing, what is it? And John's Brooklyn accent kind of met Case's Dutch ears, and Hawker was born. If you think about it, a strong New York accent saying hardcore sounds a bit like Hawker, especially if you're Dutch. So Hawker was born, and John was at the helm as founder. The idea behind Hawker, as we said in part 1, was Hawker was the imprint dealing with the hardcore records. Roadrunner, all over, is a hard rock and metal label. Hawker is an imprint, a sub-label, a child company, if you will, dealing with just the hardcore brand and hardcore signings. And yeah, that was its mission statement, effectively. So John wanted to call it something like First Offense Records or Rooting Awakening to give it some semblance of, identification. If you see First Offense Records, you kind of think, yeah, this is going to be some heavy shit, hardcore shit. But no, Case wanted Hawker. I quite like that. Maybe it's like the Britishness in me who likes a good, I like it when things come from a joke. Obviously, Hawker was, a mishearing of a New York accent saying hardcore. So the Hawker logo itself was drawn by the drummer of soon-to-be Hawker band Token Entry, Ernie Parada. In the same way that Roadrunner leaned into metal in the early 80s, it seems Hawker was on an opportunity to do something on a far smaller scale. Token Entry singer Timmy Chunks said about the potential opportunity at the time, having just signed to Hawker, "It all felt different. In 1988, bands were blowing up in our scene. Punk was done. It felt like it was hardcore's turn, especially New York hardcore. I think bands had that thought, or an underlying feeling that, yeah, we can do this." The first record out on Hawker Records was No for an Answer's A Thought Crusade in 1988. You'll notice, hopefully I've got this on the screen on the YouTube cut of this, the cover for A Thought Crusade has a rather familiar font. Looks like a fucking meme font, dude. You can see, hopefully, on the bottom left, you can see the Hawker logo. On the bottom left of the back cover of this one. So, here's John Bello on the No for an Answer album. Like the other records I did at Hawker, the budget for A Thought Crusade was around $5,000. The band did a great job with the way the record sounds because it's not overproduced like some of the other albums from that time period. Domino Principle and Rusty Pipes are two phenomenal songs from that album. The singer Dan O'Mahony had this to say. Firstly, John Bello from Hawk contacted us at an ideal time when I wasn't sensing a lot of enthusiasm, or at least prioritization from Revelation, their current label at that time, in terms of a No for an Answer LP. Furthermore, we fit the Revelation label image at the time a little bit less and less and less every day. At the time, the DIY versus the major label debate was in full swing, and in my opinion was being oversimplified. My thinking in the late 80s being that if you could contractually protect your lyrical and artistic content completely while ensuring vastly superior distribution, you had an obligation to your message to go for that larger avenue. So contrary to legend, the advance money was around $4,000, covering recording and a little merchandising, and played very little role in the decision. So it's interesting for me. So interesting that both those dudes remember the amount of money differently. It could have been that the amount that No for an Answer were given was actually $5,000, but they're based in California, so maybe it cost them $1,000 to fly them over to New York, leaving them with $4,000 to record the album. I don't know. But again, it's quite telling here that the normal thing was to have a budget of approximately $5,000. Above John saying that a good deal for Rollins was $50,000. Maybe that's just in context. Maybe $50,000 for Rollins, who was already a pretty established act at that point, I believe. If I'm thinking Black Flag was mid to late 80s, I think. Either way, he considered that a good deal. I'm not quite sure of where that's coming from, especially if everything else, for everyone else, it's $5,000. Anyway, so from here I'm just going to spitball about some other records that Hawk put out chronologically. So the next release would be Token Entry's Jaybird, as mentioned in part 1. So there's a fun anecdote to this. So the Token Entry guys came to me and I told... This is John Bello again. The Token Entry guys came to me and I told them I can get them $5,000 to do the record, and they agreed. They got Jerry Williams to engineer it, and we originally had Flea for the Red Hot Chili Peppers on board to produce it. But once the studio was booked to make Jaybird, the Peppers were getting big from their Mother's Milk album, and they had a big European tour coming up, so Flea couldn't do it. Once I told the band that Flea couldn't do it, Ernie suggested Dr. No of the Bad Brains to produce it, because they knew each other from playing shows together. So that's pretty cool. Nearly had a Flea-produced Hawker record. Again, this $5,000 album budget is clearly a Hawker staple at this point. Conversely, singer Timmy Chunks, our boy again, reported having never seen a royalty check from Roadrunner. So I'm guessing we can infer from that perhaps there's not a lot of individual revenue being made from these initial deals. Yeah, a lot of conjecture there and a bit of an assumption, but I don't know. Mike Gitter, who's another name you should remember, teed up John to Wrecking Crew, another hardcore band, making various waves, pointing out that the crossover potential, because they had all the hardcore fans who love stuff like SSD and Cro-Mags, but also the metal crowd. Wrecking Crew's Balance of Terror would come out in 1989 off the back of that Mike Gitter tip. That's pretty cool. Wrecking Crew Balance of Terror, the front cover is a little bit more cartoony, if you ask me. It looks like the front of a Viz comic. Okay, so as is fairly common in the day, the idea was thrown about to put together a compilation of bands for release on the label. So occasionally you'd get like Roadrunner Presents or whatever the label may be, just to kind of like showcase these bands. Case would go on to suggest that this, in this context for Hawker, should be a live album. So John arranged for the live recording to take place at the infamous CBGB's club on Sunday the 9th April 1989. Which would feature No for an Answer, Token Entry, Wrecking Crew, and Rest in Pieces. And here I've got a picture of some of the guys outside CBGB's Hawker Records Showcase Free For All show with members of Wrecking Crew, Rest in Pieces, and No for an Answer preparing for the photo shoot. Photo is taken by Ken Salemo. The CBGB Showcase tends to be fondly remembered in the hardcore scene. Again, Dan O'Mahony remembers it as a huge day for meeting legends of the era. I guess it was just a great gathering of hardcore acts. YouTube user Lionel PFAFF remarked, "I was there. Hands down the best show I ever saw at CB's." So yeah, I'm guessing this gig is meant to have been like quite a big deal at the time. The product of this effort was the Hawker Records Presents Free For All LP. Footage of the No for an Answer set can be found here. In fact, I'll try and throw that onto the screen for you. Similarly, the Rest in Pieces set can be found here. Check your headphones on this one, guys. Outside of those mentioned, Hawker would be the home for two other hardcore punk acts, Pagan Babies and Jones Very, featuring Vic Bondi from Articles of Faith. John himself would also be heavily involved in Rest in Pieces, another hardcore band drafted in by Road Racer. I'm chucking some images up there. So, as it comes to a close, after 17 releases from 5 bands, Hawker wrapped up in 1989. John's reported as saying, "The writing was on the wall. The records I was working on were not selling. I think that happened because of 2 reasons. First off, Roadrunner wasn't pushing any of the Hawker releases. Also, Relativity Records were distributing my records. So if you're Relativity, who would you push? Sick of It All and Killing Time, or Token Entry and No for an Answer? Listen, that's business, and I get it. Case finally said we should call it quits. I stayed on it a bit with Roadrunner, but it wasn't the same. Howie from Relativity eventually came to the label and eventually brought in bands like Madball. But I have to say, it was a lot of fun to do. Hawker and Case were always cool about everything. I'm proud of those records and getting to work with those bands." And as a closing image, I've got an image of Ernie Parada, John Bello, and Timmy Chunks from Left to Right in 2016. So that's nice to see them all together, still hanging out after, 20 or so years? 30 or so years, Christ. Anyway, so that's the story of Hawker Records, short-lived, fondly remembered. Few questions, few musing thoughts after that one. I'd like to know if the internship which John came under was a paid internship under Holly, or it was just a bog standard internship. I'm not gauging his age properly at this point, so I don't know what situation is. I don't know if Holly had the budget for paid internships. I don't know if the game plan from Case's perspective was to harvest and improve talent and like incubate the talent in the US. That's just, that's a wider question for me. Again, I'm curious about the Rollins 50k figure, what that's coming from it. Why is that a good figure? It feels to me rather largely departed from the normal 5k figure for everyone else. I'm wondering how far 5k would go as well. I mean, if 5k was the standard for Roadrunner to take on a new signing, Merciful Fate took 12 days to do Melissa. Was that on the 5k budget? Thinking back to the first part. Or did Case gamble a bit more then? Did they give him some more money? I mean, 5k back then, nowadays, is about 10 grand. And I can think of fucking a million things to do with 10 grand right now, especially in the context of recording. Could definitely get a small band some good studio time for a while. I'd love to know what John means in that last statement by it wasn't the same. Presumably he wasn't spearheading anything and he was a bit dissatisfied by this. Perhaps. I don't know. But yeah, that's the story of Hawker. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that quick side story to the Roadrunner story. Again, in the absence of Rory, it'll be difficult for me to really play off what the fuck I'm playing at.